Right, good evening everybody. Can we kick off with apologies for absence?
Chairman, apologies from Councillor Philip Cawthorne, Councillor Jonathan Bianco.
Thank you. Before I move to the formal agenda, Chief Whip, I think you need to say something.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, subject to the adverse weather conditions outside and with the benefit of electronic devices nowadays, I have been advised by the majority, well, almost all of our members of the Executive Scrutiny Committee that none of them are anywhere near to the building. They're stuck in Northwood and Ruislip and in Cowley, and they would have difficulty in getting here this evening. If possible, we would like to cancel the meeting and re-adjourn it for within the next 7 days period. Thank you.
Everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest in matters before us this meeting? None. In which case, can we approve the minutes of the last Cabinet meeting, which are shown on pages 1 to 10?
Agreed.
Thank you. And as usual, to confirm that the items marked Part 1 will be considered in public, and those in Part 2 in private, and the public part of the agenda is agenda items 5 to 9. So, moving to the first item, agenda item 5, which is page 11 of the agenda, Uxbridge High Street pedestrian zone, enforcement of parking and moving traffic contraventions. Councillor Burrows.
Thank you, Leader. This will delight many residents that have been writing to both myself and you, Leader, about the traffic that parks along the High Street, and also councillors that have continually badgered me about the traffic that parks along there at weekends and during the week. Two in particular. One, Mayor of Hillingdon, Councillor Hensley, has often been speaking to me about this issue, and also Councillor John Oswell, who has also sent me numerous photographs over the months of the traffic that's been parked there. So this is a welcomed report, and I'd like to thank officers for getting this before Cabinet as quickly as they did. The reason it's had to come to Cabinet is, as you remember, we actually stopped enforcement of parking, moving traffic contraventions. Therefore, our enforcement team were unable to do anything. We were unable to do anything with the cameras that are actually along the High Street, because as a Cabinet, we actually banned that. So this actually moves to correcting that now along this section of the High Street, the pedestrian zone, because obviously we want this for pedestrians and for it to be as safe as possible for pedestrians. So the recommendations we have here on page 12, the first is to improve the installation of movable barriers at both ends of the pedestrian zone in the High Street to enforce correct delivery and unloading times. These barriers will be designed, and obviously, Leader, they will not be agreed until you and I are happy that we've got something that we like at either end of the main High Street here in Uxbridge. But they will be designed so that we can enforce the correct delivery and unloading times, which are already stipulated on signs out in the High Street there. And then recommendation 2 goes on to agree Deputy Chief Executive and Corporate Director of Resident Services, in conjunction with myself and you, Leader, you should have been in on this recommendation, approve the design of the barriers. I think it's important that we do get a design that we're happy with. I have seen some already, and officers are working on that. Recommendation 3, approve the enforcement of moving traffic contraventions by CCTV in this part of the area. Now, we can do this because the signs are already in place. We will put extra signs in showing that the cameras will be used, so there will be no entrapment. People will have clear indication that we will enforce this from now on. And recommendation 4 delegates any further decisions, such as enforcement of appropriate weighting, loading restrictions required, to myself in conjunction with the Corporate Director of Resident Services, Deputy Chief Executive. Other schemes grant full delegated authority to you, Leader, and me as a Cabinet member, in conjunction with Deputy Chief Executive, to determine the use of moving traffic contraventions in a borough on a case-by-case basis. This sets out the fact that where we have these MTCs currently in place, we will not have to bring it back to Cabinet every single time, because this recommendation being moved now means that in conjunction we can actually lift up moving traffic contravention somewhere else. And recommendation 6, subject to your formal consent, add this as a permanent delegation within the Council's constitution under the Cabinet scheme of delegations, Leader. So I so move and welcome this report, and I'm sure there's many residents and councillors alike that are going to be very happy to see the Cabinet accept this.
Thank you, Councillor Burrows. I think, just for clarity, I think you did make it fairly clear, we're not in the business of using CCTV to fine people to rack up money, as a number of authorities do, which is why we stopped these moving traffic contraventions in the first place. We will only use it where it's a safety issue in areas such as this or outside the schools that we have mentioned at our last meeting. And as you rightly say, to avoid bringing each one back, we will do this one as an example, and from now on we will have delegated powers to introduce it where appropriate. Councillor Simmons?
I was just going to mention, Leader, the significance of the other schemes element of the recommendations, which I think is one of the really positive things in this report. I know Hillingdon does not have that many pedestrianised shopping areas, but I think of Hayes Town, which in the past has attracted quite a lot of controversy, debates with members about whether it should be completely reopened to traffic, partially reopened to traffic, and issues being raised by residents over the years. And I just think we should make sure that all members are aware that that flexibility is contained within this report, because it may mean that we can do something positive in some of the other areas where those similar types of concerns have been raised also.
Thank you. Are the recommendations agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. Agenda item 6, page 21, the Better Care Fund, section 75 agreement. The Better Care Fund is something that we operate together with the local Hillingdon Clinical Commissioning Group, and this is the mandatory process, the legal process that we have to go through to have a joint funded budget. We put in an element of funding, the CCG put in an element of funding, and the Better Care Fund is monitored by the Health and Wellbeing Board on a quarterly basis as we go through the year. This is for the coming year. We've got one in place. We had one in place for last year, and it works fairly well. Effectively, as a council, we will control the finance, and we accept that responsibility, and the CCG are giving it to us under this this section 75 agreement. There's a lot of detail in the report. The Better Care Fund that we have going forward is larger than the one we've had this year. It's still not as ambitious as I'd like it to be, but we hope that as we get better working relationship with our CCG, that will expand. We also have further complications now of a sustainable transformation plan which the Health Service have introduced, which in true Health Service form, it had to be submitted by the 30th of June, but now it hasn't got to be submitted by the 30th of June. That's just a milestone. I described it as more like a tombstone, to be honest, because as soon as you stop. But it'll go on, and sometime by December we'll have something there. But for the moment, the Better Care Fund worked well last year. It delivered almost within budget, which was pretty good, but it delivered on all of its targets. So the recommendations are shown on page 22. We enter a pooled budget arrangement known as the Better Care Fund. We delegate authority to the Leader of the Council and the Cabinet Member for Social Services, Housing, Health and Wellbeing, in consultation with the Corporate Director of Finance and the Corporate Director of Social Care, to amend this Section 75 agreement to include risk share arrangements for a specialist care home service for people at end of life. There's just one thing that we've not quite finalised, and as we do, we will put that in. Are those recommendations agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 7, planning obligations, the quarterly financial monitoring report. Councillor Burrows.
Thank you, Leader. This is the usual report that comes before Cabinet. All the detail is within this report, as you see, within the financial costs. And I would just put in the usual caveat that Cabinet members look within their own areas, see if there are any spends that they think we should be moving quicker, and obviously make the relevant contact with officers or myself to see what is happening with them. You can see where the largest amount of money currently sits, and it always sits in that area. and I move the recommendation that we note the updated financial information as attached, Appendix 1.
Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 8, page 155. This is the council budget 15-16 revenue and capital budget outturn, the year-end accounts, the accounts for the 31st of March. In the absence of Councillor Bianco, I will move the recommendations 1 to 11. Just for completeness, I'll say it's a good news story. But it is a very good news story when compared to the financial affairs of some other local authorities, and it does really set Hillingdon apart from other local authorities. Looking at the recommendations, the first one is to note the outturn position, and the outturn position is broadly that we've come in £3.5 million ahead of budget. So we've not only achieved the budget that we set ourselves, we're £3.5 million ahead of budget. That allows us to have £39 million in balances to carry into the current year. The recommendation 2 is to note the Treasury Management update. Now that's shown at Appendix E on page 192, and as usual it shows where our money is held and whatever, but I think one of the points worth noting is that during the year the council utilised internal balances, so no new borrowing was taken to fund capital expenditure. The council's loan portfolio has an average rate of 3.01%, but that portfolio was reduced by 12.3 million. 12.3 million paid off during the year with debt that matured. So again, not a bad Treasury Management position. Recommendation 3 is to continue the delegated authority given to myself and the Chief Executive to approve any assignment of agency assignment where the agency fee goes over £50,000. That's a consultancy or an agency fee, and those are detailed in Appendix F on page 197 to 200. Recommendation 4, this is a technical point, to ratify the release of the development and risk contingency funds to the operating budget. They're set out in Table 5 on page 162. It's approved by myself and the Corporate Director of Finance. We set aside money at the beginning of the year in contingency funds for all sorts of purposes, and at the year end we roll what's left into our general budget, into balances effectively, and carry it forward. Recommendation 5 is to approve the rephasing of 24,782,000 of general fund and 162,000 of housing revenue account capital budgets from 15-16 into future years, and that's outlined in Appendix D on page 186. This is rolling forward the improvement programs that we have, the capital programs that will just move on as we're building them over the year end. Recommendation 6 approves the addition of the following grants for 16-17 revenue budgets. We received in from the Cabinet Office individual electoral registration grant of 104,427. That, and it may have something to do with the events of today, but the government were quite keen that we had the maximum people on the electoral roll as possible, and that grant was for that purpose. I'd like to add to that figure an additional £8,659, which we've recently received. This was because of the extension of the deadline for registration that occurred. The grant was enhanced by £8,659, so if we could note that as part of this recommendation. And the Department of Education also gave us £92,150,000 for supporting entitlement to free early years childcare. So recommendation 6 is to note that we receive those into our revenue budget. Recommendation 7 is the acceptance of planning performance agreement income. These are amounts paid by developers who have planning applications in to fund the cost of their particular, or part of the cost of their particular applications, and they are detailed A to E paper. And number 8, recommendation 8, I talked earlier about development and risk contingency. One of the things we have to do is try to work out as best we can the cost of things like increases in national insurance contributions. When we're setting our budgets earlier in the year, we start the process in December and February, and we know that's not going to kick in until the new tax year. So having passed the new tax year, we will move 1.8 million from our contingency into the account from which the salaries are paid, and that will cover our national insurance contributions. Recommendation 9 is to ratify an emergency contract decision that I took with the Chief Executive in May. This was around a care provider who served notice on the council that they were unable to continue with domiciliary care and support of residents, and we had to act quickly to replace them. So that was why emergency contract decision was taken. The details are shown in paragraph 9 of the report. And the recommendations 10 and 11 are the same thing. We approved a contract variation of 72.5k to our Benson Property Maintenance for additional works that were required as part of the refurbishment of Harlington Bowls Club and Pinkwell Pavilion. And 11 is the actual cost of that build was 32,000 more than we'd set aside. So this is providing additional funds for that cost of that project, which was well received by all the users of the Bowls Club and the pavilion. So they are the 11 recommendations. I think we should at this stage congratulate the officers of the council, particularly the finance director and perhaps deputy chief executive. You'll thank all the staff, senior staff who have been involved in this. This is a very good news story, and it's a pity Councillor Bianco isn't here for his best news story of the year. We are the most efficient financial council in London, without a doubt. We are probably, if we're not the most efficient in the country, we're there or thereabouts. And to be able to set a budget that we've set for the coming year as well, no impact on services, facility improvements, tax frozen for 9 years, 39 million in balances. I think we're well placed. That's not that we underestimate at all the challenges that are ahead of us, and we must always be mindful of that. But I think at this stage we can pause and congratulate ourselves for a brief period of time before we move on to what's ahead of us. Councillor Simmons.
Well, thank you, Leader. I think there's a couple of things that I'd like to mention. The first two relate very much to the specific content of the report. You touched on the non-treasury prudential indicators and the context of other councils. I think one of the things that is important when we look at this is it shows that the financial position of the council remains sustainable for the long term. And I think it's particularly important when we consider things like school places, which are massive capital programmes, hugely expensive. We have made a policy decision that we will provide good quality facilities. We are not purely going to do things at the cheapest possible way. We're going to provide things that in 25 years will still be standing up to daily use for the children and the teachers who are working on them. And that's happened in a way that, although it's now left quite a substantial external debt, is an external debt that remains well within the financial capacity of the authority to manage. I know there's a lot of debate about this, councils talking about the level of external debt that they're managing, but I think that is a really, really important healthcare indicator of how well managed and effective the budget is. And the second part arising from the content of the report was just to flag up the developments in the social work market. And I think we should mention the input that's come from both Hillingdon HR and also from the Director for Children's Services in helping to bring about a much more sustainable permanent workforce for Hillingdon. But also to highlight there have been some changes recently about social work standards, which are encouraging more social workers, I think, to recognise the benefits of being permanent employees, and something which all councils have wrestled with for quite a long time. We're beginning to see now the signs that more social workers are saying, rather than being an agency worker, where the tax benefits probably are very strong, the benefits of being an employed member of staff may mean that going through those high professional standards where you have the support of an employer will help to improve that situation still further. And then just two things that are slightly external to this that are worth mentioning. The first of those, clearly, as the leaders mentioned, Hillingdon is in a very solid financial position. I know there's a lot of interest. The local government association that I'm involved with is quite keen to come and talk to us about the way finance operates here, because I think there's stuff that other councils would like to learn from that. But I think as Cabinet, when we do the outturn, we should also recognise the huge contribution the leaders made to this. I know I was talking to your former boss recently, who made mention that when you worked with him in practice, he was in the habit of fining any accountant who hadn't billed sufficient hours in a particular week. So he used to check, apparently, every week whether you and your colleagues had actually done that, and if you hadn't, you were sent a bill to make up. Well, clearly that level of input is perhaps not something that our Director of Finance will be totally comfortable with, unless there's something he's not telling us. However, I think we do need to recognise that elected member input, and particularly yours, Leader, has been hugely important, and that's helped Hillingdon to remain in sound financial health.
Councillor Mills.
I just want to add, in terms, it is a very encouraging, useful position on which we continue to go forward. And clearly we have benefited from making decisions some time ago about how we were going to structure the council, and also clearly the work that BEAD is continuing to do in terms of examining each of the budgets and the way in which we set up and manage to avoid additional costs whilst continuing to provide the services. And we are in a position, but of course we've always got to remember the challenges get harder each year. And there are things that we need to continue to step up and be able to accommodate. And not least, I think, to my mind, some of the uncertainty still about the government's transition from revenue support grant to relying on business rates. And Hillingdon being one of those boroughs, because of a significant contributor to the national business rate, because of a certain airport in the south of the borough, exactly how all that is going to end up in our benefit. And I know that we're very alert to that, and the opportunity to try and get leverage and be able to have the powers to vary business rate for certain businesses, especially maybe if they've got wings.
That's a very good point, Councillor Mills. Apart from Westminster, we collect more business rates than any other borough, London Borough. And it's always been a bone of contention with me that whenever there's anything involved around Heathrow, if it's money, it's a national asset and everybody needs a share. If it's things like unaccompanied asylum seeking children, it's a local issue and it falls on the council. So that we might be able to amend that in years to come. For the moment though, our recommendations 1 to 11 approved. Agreed. Thank you. Moving on then, agenda item 9, page 201, is the school capital programme update. Councillor Simmons.
Thank you, Leader. We continue to progress on the whole very well with the school's capital programme. A couple of things that I'm particularly mentioned, because we are now moving to the stage where a lot of our efforts will be focused on secondary schools in the borough. And the primary programme, although there are still works underway at a number of sites, largely has satisfied the demand that we've seen coming through the system, and seems to indicate we broadly have the capacity that we need for the projected rises that are coming in the immediate years ahead. But first to mention Abbotsfield and Swakeleys. I know Councillor Bridges is here in the audience this evening, and he's been lobbying very strongly with his ward colleagues. I'm very pleased to say, this having been a big cause for concern, that Section 106 agreement for that development has now been signed. And although I think it is a case of weather permitting, he says, glancing out the window, the Education Funding Agency are due to be getting works underway if they haven't already actually moved on to the site. We have evidence that they moved onto the site. That's excellent. The discussions that have taken place with other secondary schools have now been concluded, and those sites which are proceeding to the design stage have been agreed, and those sites which are not proceeding to the design stage at this point clearly have been notified that that is the case. I think it's important to say, if the rise in numbers that we've seen in primary schools does reflect through into secondary schools, and that isn't entirely certain, because we do know some parents opt to go private, others decide to go over the border to grammar schools and things like that. So it's not necessarily a straightforward read across. Then it is likely that many more of our secondary schools will need to be expanded in due course. But those projects are well in hand, and hopefully will provide all the places that we need in the same way as the primary school expansions have provided to date.
Thank you. Is the recommendation agreed? Agreed. Thank you. We now move to part 2 of the agenda.